Picture this. You're 23 years old, fresh out of college, and you just landed your dream job making more money than you ever imagined possible. You're living responsibly, saving every penny for your first house, renting a modest apartment way below your means. Everything's going perfectly, until your landlord discovers exactly how much you're making. And then, he decides that since you can afford it, he's going to squeeze every last dollar out of you that he possibly can. What would you do if someone looked at your success and decided it was their right to take advantage of you? What if they humiliated you, extorted you, and then had the audacity to tell you, you don't have to like it. You just have to pay it? Well, sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. And sometimes, karma needs a little help from a well-timed coincidence and a friend who believes in justice. This is the story of how a greedy landlord's jealousy cost him $20,000 in cold, hard cash. And trust me, by the end of this story, you're going to feel that sweet, sweet satisfaction of perfect revenge. Before we dive into this absolutely wild tale of landlord karma, if you love stories where the bad guy gets what's coming to them, go ahead and smash that like button right now. And if you want more stories about people who thought they could walk all over someone, only to face the consequences years later, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about how treating people poorly can come back to haunt you in ways you never saw coming. It's about standing up for yourself, even when it takes years to get your chance. And most importantly, it's about how being a decent human being to others, well, it actually matters more than you think. So grab your headphones, get comfortable, and let me tell you about Hank Wazowski, a man whose greed and jealousy would eventually cost him more money in one phone call than most people make in 6 months. Trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of this one. Let's set the scene. It's the late 1990s. The internet is exploding, .com companies are sprouting up everywhere like digital mushrooms, and if you know how to write code, you're basically printing money. Our protagonist, let's call her Rocky, has just gotten married to the love of her life. They're young, they're optimistic, and they've made a smart decision that would make any financial advisor proud. They're going to be dinks. Double income, no kids. For those of you who've never heard this term, it's basically the cheat code for building wealth in your 20s. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Rocky had just landed a software developer job that tripled her previous salary. We're talking about going from struggling college graduate to making $75,000 a year at age 23. In the late 90s, for someone just 2 years out of college, this wasn't just good money. This was holy crap, I made it money. But here's what made Rocky and her husband different from most young couples who suddenly find themselves flush with cash. They didn't let lifestyle inflation eat them alive. Instead, they made a pact. They would live entirely off her husband's income and save every single penny of Rocky's salary. Every single penny. Why? Because they had their eyes on the prize. A house. Not just any house, but their forever home, complete with a 20% down payment so they could avoid PMI and get the best possible mortgage rate. The math was simple and beautiful. 1 year of living frugally, 1 year of sacrifice, and they'd have enough money to buy their dream home without being house poor. But first, they needed a place to live in their new city. And that's where they found a modest 2-bedroom condo listed for $950 a month. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't in the trendiest neighborhood, but it was clean, safe, and most importantly, it was way below their means. Perfect for a young couple focused on their future, rather than impressing anyone with their lifestyle. Now, let me paint you a picture of the landlord because this guy is important to our story. His name was Hank Wazowski, and if Central Casting was looking for someone to play generic real estate agent number 3, Hank would have gotten the part without even auditioning. Picture a thin, gray-haired man in his 50s. The kind of guy who wears polo shirts tucked into khakis and owns exactly one pair of white New Balance sneakers that he considers athletic wear. Hank had the personality of a wet paper towel and the sense of humor of a tax audit. He was all business all the time with the social skills of someone who considers small talk a waste of billable hours. But here's the thing about Hank, he was also a real estate agent who owned this condo as an investment property. And like a lot of landlords, he had that special combination of penny-pinching paranoia and petty power-tripping that makes dealing with them feel like a psychological endurance test. The first red flag should have been his weird obsession with the garbage disposal. Before they'd even finished the walkthrough, Hank made sure to explain multiple times that under absolutely no circumstances was he responsible for maintaining the garbage disposal. It wasn't included in the rental agreement. If it broke, they were on their own. He said this with the intensity of someone explaining how to defuse a bomb. Rocky and her husband exchanged glances. Who gets that worked up about a garbage disposal? But hey, they were young, they were optimistic, and the apartment was perfect for their needs. Besides, how hard could it be to deal with one quirky landlord for a year? Oh, if only they had known. Here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Because when Rocky and her husband filled out the rental application and credit check, they had to list their employment information, job title, employer, and of course, annual salary. Rocky wrote down software developer and $75,000 in neat handwriting, probably feeling pretty good about himself. After all, he'd worked hard to get where he was, and those numbers represented security, opportunity, and the foundation of their future together. But when Hank looked at that application, something shifted in his demeanor. His eyebrows shot up. He looked at the paper, then at Rocky, then back at the paper again. "I can't believe how much money you make," Hank said, and there was something in his voice that Rocky couldn't quite identify at the time. Was it amazement? Respect? No. It was envy. Pure green-eyed toxic envy. Hank said it again. And then again. "I can't believe how much money you make." Over and over like a broken record, muttering it under his breath while he processed their application. Rocky tried to play it off casually. He explained that they were saving for a house, that they planned to stay just 1 year, maybe a few extra months on a month-to-month basis after the lease ended if their house purchase timing didn't align perfectly. Month-to-month would be fine, Hank assured them, though his eyes kept drifting back to that salary figure on the application. And that's when something ugly took root in Hank's mind. He was looking at this young couple, this kid barely out of college and his new wife, and seeing dollar signs. Not just the $950 a month they'd agreed to pay, but all the money they could potentially pay. Because if Rocky was making $75,000 and his wife was working too, that meant they had serious disposable income. That meant they could afford more than $950 a month. Way more. And in Hank's twisted logic, that meant they should pay more. For the next year, Rocky and her husband lived quietly in their little condo, sticking to their plan. They furnished it modestly, lived below their means, and steadily built their house fund. Rocky threw herself into her work, her husband continued at his job, and every month they watched their savings account grow. It should have been a peaceful, productive year. And it mostly was, except for one thing. Hank's weird obsession with Rocky's income. They only saw their landlord once during that entire year, some minor maintenance issue that required his attention. But instead of handling it professionally and leaving, Hank lingered. And sure enough, the conversation drifted to the same uncomfortable territory. "I still can't believe how much money software developers make these days," Hank said, shaking his head like he was witnessing some cosmic injustice. "It's just incredible. The money you young people are earning." There was something accusatory in his tone, as if Rocky had somehow cheated or taken something that didn't belong to him, as if success at a young age was inherently suspicious or undeserved. Rocky gave a vague, non-committal response and tried to change the subject, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Hank was calculating something in his head. There was an intensity to the way Hank looked at him, like a predator sizing up its prey. But Rocky pushed those uncomfortable feelings aside. After all, what was Hank going to do? They had a lease, they paid their rent on time, they were model tenants. Everything was fine. Everything was not fine. As their lease year drew to a close, Rocky and her husband's diligent saving had paid off beautifully. They had enough money for a substantial down payment, their credit was excellent, and they found the perfect house. Not too big, not too small, in a great neighborhood with good schools for the future kids they were planning. There was just one tiny problem with the timing. The house wouldn't be ready for 2 months after their lease expired. 2 months. It was such a small gap. Barely a blip in the grand scheme of their life plan. Rocky wasn't worried after all. Hank had already agreed that month-to-month extensions would be fine. So Rocky picked up the phone and called his landlord. "Hi Hank, it's Rocky. Good news, we found a house." The only thing is, it won't be ready until 2 months after our lease ends. Would it be possible to extend our lease on a month-to-month basis for those 2 months, like we discussed? Hank's response was smooth as silk. Oh, absolutely, Rocky. No problem at all. I'll send over an extension for you to sign. Rocky felt a wave of relief. See, everything was working out perfectly. Hank was being completely reasonable, just like any professional landlord would be. The extension arrived in the mail 3 days later. And that's when Rocky discovered what Hank had been calculating all those months. Rocky opened the envelope expecting a simple month-to-month extension at their current rent of $950. What he found instead made his blood pressure spike so hard he could hear his heartbeat in his ears. The rent increase was $500. $500. Not $50. Not $100. $500, bringing their monthly rent to $1,450. An increase of over 50%. For context, Rocky's new mortgage payment was going to be less than $1,450. Hank was literally trying to charge them more to rent his little 2-bedroom condo than it would cost them to own a 3-bedroom house. Rocky's hands were shaking as she dialed Hank's number. Hank, what the hell is this? Why are you increasing the rent by $500? That's ridiculous. That's more than my mortgage is going to be. And here's where Hank revealed his true character. Gone was any pretense of professionalism or basic human decency. His voice was cold, condescending, and dripping with the kind of smugness that makes you want to reach through the phone. Rocky, it's what the apartment goes for now. I would be losing money by renting it for less. Losing money? The guy had been making a profit at $950 for the entire year they'd been there. The apartment was the same apartment. Nothing had changed except Hank's knowledge of how much money Rocky made. Rocky tried to reason with him. He explained that they were only staying 2 more months, that this was an emergency situation, that a 50% rent increase was unreasonable by any standard. But Hank wasn't interested in reason. He wasn't interested in fairness. He wasn't even interested in maintaining a professional relationship with good tenants. He was interested in one thing: extracting every possible dollar from these young people who had made the mistake of being financially successful. The conversation grew heated. Rocky's voice rose as he tried to make Hank understand how unfair and exploitative this was. And that's when Hank delivered the line that would haunt Rocky for years to come. His voice turned icy cold, and with the casual cruelty of someone who holds all the power, Hank said, "You don't have to like it, Rocky. You just have to pay it." Think about those words for a second. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it. It's the verbal equivalent of a slap in the face. It's pure, distilled contempt wrapped up in a business transaction. It was Hank's way of saying, I know this is unfair. I know this is wrong. I know you hate this. And I don't care because I have power over you right now, and you're going to do exactly what I say. Rocky hung up the phone feeling like she'd been punched in the gut. Her husband could see the anger and frustration radiating off her as she explained what had just happened. They spent the next few hours trying to figure out alternatives. Could they move out early and stay with friends? Could they put their furniture in storage and find a short-term furnished place? Could they negotiate with the sellers to move up their closing date? Every option they explored led to dead ends. Moving twice would cost almost as much as paying Hank's extortion fee. Short-term rentals were even more expensive. Their friends were generous, but asking to crash at someone's place for 2 months with all their belongings wasn't realistic. They were trapped and Hank knew it. So Rocky did what millions of people have done when faced with an unfair choice and no alternatives. He swallowed his pride and wrote the check. $1,450. As she signed her name on that check, Rocky felt something harden inside her chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, quiet determination that someday, somehow Hank would regret treating them this way. But for now, all he could do was pay. A month later, Rocky wrote another check for $1,450. And then finally, mercifully, they were able to move into their new house. Rocky made sure the apartment was absolutely spotless before they left. He spent hours cleaning every surface, every corner, every appliance. He wanted to make sure Hank couldn't find a single legitimate reason to withhold any of their security deposit. Hank found reasons anyway. $300 worth of reasons to be exact. $100 for cleaning the apartment that Rocky had just spent a full day cleaning. $200 more for various mysterious damages that hadn't existed during their walkthrough. It was the final insult. Hank had already extorted an extra $1,000 from them over 2 months, and now he was stealing another $300 from their security deposit just because he could. In Rocky's mind, the total damage was $1,200. $1,200 that Hank had taken from them through nothing but greed and the temporary power imbalance of a landlord-tenant relationship. But the story gets even more infuriating. A few days after they moved out, Rocky was browsing the local newspaper. This was back when people still did that. And he saw something that made his vision turn red. There, in the classifieds section, was an ad for their old apartment. Rent. $1,100. Not $1,450. Not even $1,200. Just $1,100. Only $150 more than what Rocky and his wife had been paying for the entire year. Hank had lied about everything. The market hadn't suddenly jumped by 50%. Hank had simply invented a number that he knew Rocky could afford and decided to charge it. A month later, Rocky saw the same ad again, but this time the price had dropped to $1,025, only $75 more than their original rent. And then the ads disappeared, presumably because someone had rented it at that reasonable price. So let's do the math. Hank had charged them an extra $500 per month for 2 months, $1,000 total, when the actual market rate would have justified an increase of maybe $150 total. He had stolen $850 from them through pure greed and lies. Add in the bogus security deposit charges, and Rocky calculated that Hank had cheated them out of $1,200. $1,200 that a young couple had worked hard for, saved carefully, and had stolen from them by someone who saw their success and decided he deserved a piece of it. Rocky and her husband moved on with their lives. They loved their new house, they started a family, and even though the dot-com bubble eventually burst, Rocky's skills kept her employed. Life was good. But Rocky never forgot about Hank Wazowski. He never forgot the condescending tone, the casual cruelty, or those words. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it. Have you ever had someone treat you so unfairly that it burns in your memory for years? Where you find yourself thinking about it at random moments, feeling that familiar surge of anger and helplessness. That was Rocky's relationship with the memory of Hank. It wasn't that the money had ruined them. They were doing well financially. It was the principle. It was the injustice. It was the way Hank had looked at their success and decided it was his right to take advantage of them. But what could Rocky do about it? Hank was just a bad memory now, somewhere out there in the world, probably still overcharging young tenants and congratulating himself on his business acumen. And then, 5 years later, the universe decided to give Rocky a gift. Picture this. It's a regular day at Rocky's software company. He's walking past the reception desk when he overhears one of his coworkers, Phil, talking to the receptionist. Hey Mike, I'm expecting someone to drop off some paperwork for me. If a Hank Wazowski asks for me, tell him I'll be right out. Rocky stopped walking. Actually, he didn't just stop, he froze like someone had hit a pause button on his entire existence. Hank Wazowski. That name hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly he could taste bile in his mouth, could feel his heart rate spike, could remember exactly how it felt to write out those checks with that name on the pay-to line. There was no way it was the same guy. There had to be thousands of people with that name, right? It was probably just a coincidence. Just his brain playing tricks on him. But Rocky had to know. He walked over to Phil, trying to keep his voice casual. Phil, how do you know that name? Hank Wazowski. Phil looked up from his papers. Oh, he's my real estate agent. I bought my condo through him a few years ago, and now I'm selling it so I can buy a house. Going to use him as my agent again. Do you know him? Rocky's pulse was pounding in his ears. He described Hank's appearance, thin, gray-haired, no-nonsense real estate agent type. Phil nodded. Yeah, that's him exactly. Small world, huh? And that's when the front door of the office opened, and in walked the man who had haunted Rocky's memory for 5 years. Hank Wazowski in the flesh, carrying a folder of paperwork and looking exactly the same as he had all those years ago. He walked right past Rocky without recognizing him, focused entirely on his meeting with Phil. Rocky stood there in stunned disbelief, watching his old nemesis shake hands with his coworker, discussing business like nothing in the world had ever happened between them. Phil and Hank chatted for a few minutes about the condo sale and house purchase. Rocky stood nearby, silent, his mind racing through possibilities. What should he do? What could he do? This was just a weird coincidence, nothing more. And then Phil, being the friendly guy he was, decided to make introductions. Hank, this is my friend Rocky. I think you two might have already met. Rocky stepped forward, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Yes, hello Hank. Good to see you again. My husband and I were your tenants a few years ago on Maple Street. Remember? The software developer who rented for a year saving to buy a house? Well, this is where I work. Here. With Phil. Rocky watched as recognition slowly dawned in Hank's eyes. The landlord's expression shifted from polite confusion to surprise to something that might have been nervousness. Oh yes, of course I remember, Hank said, though his handshake was notably less firm than it had been with Phil. How are you and your wife doing? Oh, we're doing just fine, thanks for asking, Rocky replied with exaggerated pleasantness. Phil says you're his real estate agent. Small world, isn't it? Hank nodded, clearly trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. He still didn't remember the details of their last interaction. The rent increase, the security deposit, the condescending dismissal. But Rocky remembered everything. Rocky's mind started working like the software developer he was, processing information and calculating possibilities. This was the early 2000s and the real estate market was absolutely booming. Houses were selling fast, prices were climbing, and real estate agents were making money hand over fist. Phil was selling a condo that was probably worth around $150,000 to $200,000. And he was looking to buy a house in the $500,000 range. That was a total transaction volume of $650,000 to $700,000. Real estate agents typically get a 3% commission on both the sale and the purchase. So Hank was looking at roughly $20,000 in commissions from Phil's transactions. $20,000. For a few months of work, some paperwork, and showing houses, Rocky started thinking out loud, his voice taking on a tone that Phil would later describe as weirdly intense. So Phil, selling the condo for around $150,000 to $200,000, and you're looking at houses in the $500,000 range. That's $650,000 to $700,000 in total transactions. An agent getting 3% on both the sale and the purchase is looking at around $20,000 in commissions. That's a pretty good payday for an agent, isn't it, Hank? Rocky watched Hank's eyes carefully as he spoke, and he saw the exact moment when Hank remembered everything. The rent increase, the security deposit, the cruel dismissal. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it. Phil looked confused by Rocky's suddenly aggressive tone, but Hank's expression had shifted to something closer to fear. Well, it's more complicated than that, Hank deflected, clearly wanting to end this conversation and get out of there. Rocky was enjoying the uncomfortable silence that followed. For the first time in 5 years, he held the power in their relationship. Hank quickly wrapped up his business with Phil, shaking hands and reminding him to send back the paperwork as soon as possible. He nodded curtly at Rocky and headed for the door. It was really good to see you again, Hank, Rocky called after him, her voice dripping with false sincerity. As the door swung shut behind Hank, Rocky spoke just loudly enough for the departing landlord to hear. Phil, don't sign anything just yet. I have a story to tell you. Phil stared at Rocky with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Rocky, what the hell was that all about? You were being weird and hostile to my real estate agent. And so Rocky told him everything. She told Phil about the year in the apartment, about Hank's obsession with her salary, about the casual way Hank had mentioned how much money she made. She told him about the $500 rent increase that came out of nowhere, about being trapped with no alternatives, about Hank's cold, dismissive response when Rocky tried to negotiate. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it, Rocky repeated, her voice hardening on those words. That's what he said to me, Phil. Like I was some kind of cash machine that existed for his benefit. She told Phil about the security deposit theft, about discovering the real market rent in the newspaper, about calculating that Hank had stolen $1,200 from them through nothing but greed and opportunism. Phil, I'm telling you, this guy is a predator. He saw that we were young and making good money, and he decided we were fair game. He extorted us because he could, and he enjoyed doing it. Phil listened to the whole story, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like disgust. Wow, Phil said when Rocky finished. I mean, I'm a little surprised. I've always known Hank as a pretty straightforward guy. But honestly, I can totally see him doing exactly what you described. Phil paused, processing everything he just heard. There's no way I can use him now, Phil continued. I mean, how could I? What kind of person does that to young tenants who are just trying to get started in life? And then Phil's eyes lit up with a mischievous gleam that Rocky would remember for the rest of her life. What do you want me to say when I fire him? Rocky felt a surge of affection for her coworker that went beyond ordinary friendship. Phil wasn't just willing to drop Hank as his agent. He wanted to make sure Hank knew exactly why he was being dropped. They spent the next hour crafting the perfect phone call. It had to be professional enough that Hank couldn't accuse Phil of anything inappropriate, but clear enough that Hank would understand he was being punished for his past behavior. Most importantly, they made sure to include certain key phrases that would drive the message home. Rocky's only regret was that she couldn't witness Hank's reaction in person, but she stood behind Phil the next day as her friend made the call that would cost Hank Wazowski $20,000. Phil dialed Hank's number while Rocky listened, practically vibrating with anticipation. Hi Hank. It's Phil calling. Rocky could hear the warmth in Phil's voice, the same friendly tone he'd used during their meeting. Hank probably thought this was just a routine follow-up call. Yeah, about that real estate deal. I've decided to get some other quotes from other agents. I'm not going to be signing up with you after all. There was a pause as Hank responded, probably expressing surprise and trying to figure out what had gone wrong. No, you shouldn't give me a discount, Phil continued, and Rocky had to suppress a laugh. You'd be losing money if you did that. Another pause. Rocky could imagine Hank's confusion, probably wondering why Phil was echoing the same logic he'd used to justify his business practices. No, this is just a decision I've made, Phil said, his voice remaining pleasant and professional. No, it has nothing to do with Rocky. Of course, this was a lie. It had everything to do with Rocky, and they all knew it. And then came the moment Rocky had been waiting 5 years for. Phil's voice took on the same cold, dismissive tone that Hank had used all those years ago. Well, you don't have to like it, Hank. You just have to accept it. Goodbye. The line went dead. Rocky stood there in the silence that followed, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years. Complete, total, perfect satisfaction. Hank Wazowski had just lost $20,000 in easy commissions because of his own past behavior. $20,000, nearly 17 times the amount he had stolen from Rocky and her husband. But more than the money, it was the justice of it all. Hank had used his temporary position of power to humiliate and exploit a young couple, thinking there would never be any consequences. He had treated their success with contempt and their desperation with cruelty. And now, years later, when Hank thought that chapter of his life was safely in the past, it had come back to cost him dearly. The beauty of it was that Hank knew exactly why he'd lost the deal. Phil's final words, Rocky's words, really made that crystal clear. Hank would replay that phone call in his mind, understanding that his past cruelty had directly caused his present loss. You don't have to like it, you just have to accept it. Those words, thrown back at him after all these years, must have hit like a sledgehammer. What made this revenge so satisfying wasn't just the financial loss Hank suffered. It was the elegant way the universe had served justice. Rocky hadn't sought this opportunity. It had simply presented itself through pure coincidence. She hadn't had to scheme or plot or lower herself to Hank's level. She had simply told the truth to a friend, and that friend had made his own decision based on that truth. The revenge was proportional without being excessive. Hank had cost Rocky $1,200 through greed and exploitation. Rocky cost Hank $20,000 through honesty and friendship. The scales of justice weren't just balanced, they were tipped decisively in favor of the person who had been wronged. Most importantly, the revenge served a larger purpose. Phil was no longer going to be victimized by Hank's predatory practices. Other future clients would be spared whatever manipulations and exploitations Hank might have subjected them to. Rocky had turned her personal experience of injustice into protection for others. That's the kind of revenge that doesn't just feel good, it actually makes the world a slightly better place. Here's what I love about this story. It perfectly illustrates how karma actually works in the real world. Karma isn't some mystical force that automatically punishes bad people. It's the natural consequence of how our actions affect our relationships and reputation over time. Hank thought he could treat people poorly without consequences because he only saw the immediate transaction. He got his extra $1,200, Rocky moved out, case closed. But what Hank didn't understand is that every interaction we have with another person becomes part of our permanent record in that person's memory. Every act of kindness or cruelty gets filed away, waiting for the right moment to matter. Rocky carried the memory of Hank's mistreatment for 5 years. Not because he was obsessed with revenge, but because the injustice of it had burned itself into his consciousness. When the opportunity arose to share that information with someone who could act on it, Rocky did what any reasonable person would do. He told the truth, and the truth had consequences. The moment Phil hung up that phone, Rocky experienced something that went beyond simple satisfaction. It was vindication. It was proof that treating people with cruelty and contempt isn't just morally wrong, it's ultimately self-defeating. For 5 years, Rocky had carried the weight of that injustice. The humiliation of being trapped and exploited, the anger at being dismissed and belittled, the frustration of having no recourse against someone who abused their temporary power over her. And in one 5-minute phone call, all of that weight lifted. Hank Wazowski didn't just lose $20,000 that day. He lost it in a way that made it clear his past actions had consequences. He lost it while hearing his own cruel words thrown back at him. He lost it knowing that the young tenant he had dismissed and exploited years earlier had just cost him more money than most people make in half a year. Rocky had spent $1,200 under duress, feeling powerless and angry. Hank had just lost $20,000 because Rocky had the power of truth and friendship on his side. The scales of justice weren't just balanced, they were obliterated. This story teaches us something important about how we treat other people, especially when we have temporary power over them. Every landlord, every boss, every person in a position of authority faces a choice every day. Do I use this power to be fair and decent, or do I use it to extract every advantage I can? Hank chose extraction. He chose to see Rocky's success as an opportunity.